Not knowing the driver was the Don's lost son, the thug mocked him. Then the phone rang suddenly. Chapter 1. The rain fell in heavy sheets across the streets of Newark, New Jersey, turning the asphalt into rivers of reflected neon. Marcus Rivera gripped the steering wheel of his worn Honda Civic, the wipers struggling against the downpour as he navigated through the industrial district. At 28 years old, he had spent his entire life believing he was nobody special. An orphan raised in foster care, bounced from home to home until he aged out of the system at 18. Now he worked as a delivery driver for a small logistics company, earning just enough to pay rent on his cramped studio apartment in a building that should have been condemned years ago. The GPS on his cracked phone screen directed him toward a warehouse address he had never delivered to before. His supervisor had called him specifically for this job, which struck Marcus as strange since he usually handled residential deliveries. But the pay was double the normal rate, and Marcus needed every dollar he could get. His car was making a concerning noise, and he could not afford another repair bill. As he turned onto the dimly lit street, Marcus noticed several expensive vehicles parked outside a seemingly abandoned warehouse. Black SUVs with tinted windows lined the narrow road, their presence incongruous with the decrepit surroundings. Something about the scene made his stomach tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. He was just a delivery driver. Whatever business these people had was none of his concern. Marcus pulled his car to a stop near the warehouse entrance, checking the package on his passenger seat. It was a small box, surprisingly light, with no return address and only a coded number where the sender's information should have been. His instructions were simple. Deliver the package to the man at the loading dock and leave. No signature required, no questions asked. He stepped out of the car, pulling his hoodie over his head in a futile attempt to shield himself from the rain. The water immediately soaked through the thin fabric, sending a chill down his spine. As he approached the loading dock, he noticed a group of men standing under a metal awning, cigarette smoke mixing with the mist of rain around them. There were 5 of them, all dressed in expensive suits that seemed wildly out of place for a warehouse meeting at 11 o'clock at night. They stopped talking as Marcus approached, their eyes following his every movement with the predatory attention of wolves sizing up potential prey. One of them stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a thick gold chain around his neck. His suit jacket strained against his muscular frame, and a jagged scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheek. This was Vincent Caruso, though Marcus had no way of knowing that name or the fear it inspired throughout the criminal underworld of the East Coast. Vincent looked Marcus up and down, taking in his soaked hoodie, his faded jeans, his worn sneakers. A smirk spread across his face as he turned to his companions. The other men chuckled, their laughter carrying an edge of cruelty. Marcus felt his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, but he kept his expression neutral. He had learned long ago that showing weakness invited attack. In the foster homes, in the group facilities, on the streets, survival meant keeping your head down and your emotions hidden. He held up the package. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I have a delivery for this address. Someone needs to sign for it." Vincent stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the acrid scent of cigarettes. The larger man towered over him by at least 6 inches, using his physical presence as an obvious intimidation tactic. "Look at this," Vincent said to his crew, his voice dripping with contempt. "They send us a delivery boy. A soaking wet delivery boy who looks like he just crawled out of a dumpster." The other men laughed again, louder this time. One of them, a wiry man with slicked back hair, pulled out his phone and started recording. Another made a comment about how the delivery company must be desperate to hire homeless people. Marcus felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but he remained calm. He had faced worse than this. He had survived worse than this. These men in their expensive suits knew nothing about real struggle, about sleeping in shelters, about wondering where your next meal would come from. "I just need someone to take the package," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Then I will be on my way." Vincent snatched the package from his hands, his movements rough and deliberately disrespectful. He tossed it to one of his men without looking, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "You know what your problem is, delivery boy?" Vincent leaned in close, his breath hot against Marcus's face. "You have no idea where you are. You have no idea who you are talking to. In this neighborhood, people like you disappear all the time. Nobody asks questions. Nobody cares." Marcus held his ground, meeting Vincent's gaze without flinching. Something flickered in his dark eyes, something that made Vincent pause for just a fraction of a second. But then the moment passed and Vincent laughed it off. "Look at him trying to act tough," Vincent announced to his crew, like he is somebody, like he matters. The wiry man with the phone moved closer, still recording. He zoomed in on Marcus's face, then panned down to his worn clothes and cheap shoes. "This is what happens when you let just anyone walk around our territory," the wiry man said. "No respect, no fear. Maybe we should teach him a lesson about respect." Vincent nodded slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred face. He reached into his jacket, and Marcus tensed, preparing himself for whatever was about to happen. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know when violence was imminent, but before Vincent could complete his movement, a phone rang. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, its ringtone a classical piece that seemed absurdly out of place in the grimy warehouse setting. Vincent froze. His hand withdrew from his jacket, and he pulled out his phone, his expression shifting from cruel amusement to something Marcus could not quite read. Fear, perhaps, or maybe something closer to dread. The other men had gone silent. Their laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy tension that pressed down on the entire scene. Even the rain seemed to fall quieter as Vincent stared at the caller ID on his screen. After what felt like an eternity, Vincent answered the call. His voice, which had been so full of swagger and menace moments ago, now carried a note of deference that bordered on subservience. "Don Castellano," Vincent said. "What an honor." Marcus watched as the color drained from Vincent's face. Whatever was being said on the other end of the line was clearly not what he wanted to hear. The other men exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I understand," Vincent said, his voice tight. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. I had no idea. We did not know." He lowered the phone slowly, his hand trembling slightly. When he looked at Marcus again, his expression had completely transformed. The contempt was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like terror. The phone call had lasted less than a minute. But in that short time, everything had changed. Vincent's men were no longer laughing. They were backing away, creating distance between themselves and Marcus, as if he had suddenly become radioactive. Vincent cleared his throat, attempting to regain some composure. His voice was carefully controlled when he spoke again, but Marcus could hear the undercurrent of fear beneath the surface. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Vincent said. "A serious misunderstanding." Marcus remained silent, watching the dramatic shift in the group's demeanor with growing confusion. He had no idea what had just happened, no understanding of why a single phone call could so completely reverse the power dynamic. All he knew was that something significant had occurred, something that had turned these dangerous men into nervous, almost fearful figures. "The Don wants to see you," Vincent continued, each word seeming to cost him physical effort. "He is sending a car. It will be here in 5 minutes. You are to wait here until it arrives." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. The Don. He had heard that title before, in movies and television shows about organized crime. It was a title reserved for the head of a crime family, the most powerful figure in the underworld hierarchy. Why would someone like that want to see him? He was nobody, a delivery driver, an orphan with no family, no connections, no significance whatsoever. But the fear in Vincent's eyes was real. The deference in his voice was genuine. Whatever was happening, it was clearly beyond anything Marcus could have anticipated when he accepted this delivery job. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, if you are not subscribed now. This story is about to take a turn that will change everything you think you know about family, identity, and destiny. You will not want to miss what happens next. The black SUV arrived exactly 5 minutes later, as promised. It was newer and more expensive than the vehicles already parked at the warehouse, its windows tinted so dark that Marcus could not see inside. The driver who emerged was an older man in a perfectly tailored grey suit, his silver hair slicked back and his posture ramrod straight despite his age. He approached Marcus with a level of respect that seemed almost ceremonial. Without a word, he produced an umbrella and held it over Marcus, shielding him from the rain as he guided him toward the SUV. Marcus glanced back at Vincent and his crew. They stood frozen in place, watching the scene with expressions of disbelief and barely concealed fear. Whatever reputation they had built in the criminal underworld, it clearly meant nothing compared to whoever was in that SUV or whoever had made that phone call. The driver opened the rear door, gesturing for Marcus to enter. The interior was dark, lit only by soft, ambient lighting along the floor. The leather seats were cream-colored and impossibly soft, a stark contrast to the torn fabric seats in Marcus's own car. Sitting in the far corner of the back seat was an old man. He appeared to be in his 70s, with a full head of white hair and deep lines etched into his face, but his eyes were sharp and clear, holding an intensity that belied his age. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a year, and a simple gold ring on his right hand that somehow conveyed more authority than all of Vincent's flashy jewelry combined. The old man studied Marcus for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his weathered face softened into something that might have been wonder, or perhaps grief, or maybe both at once. When the old man finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of decades of power and command. "You have your mother's eyes," the old man said. "I would recognize them anywhere." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. The words did not make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. He opened his mouth to respond, to ask questions, to demand explanations, but no sound came out. The old man leaned forward, and in the dim light of the SUV, Marcus could see tears forming in those sharp, powerful eyes. "My name is Antonio Castellano," the old man continued, "and I have been searching for you for 28 years. Chapter 2. The SUV glided through the rain-soaked streets of Newark, heading toward Manhattan. Marcus sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process the information that Antonio Castellano had just shared. The old man had given him space, seeming to understand that some revelations require time to absorb. 28 years. That was how long Marcus had lived believing he was alone in the world. 28 years of foster homes and group facilities. 28 years of wondering why his parents had abandoned him, why nobody had ever come looking for him, why he seemed destined to face the world completely and utterly alone. And now this elderly stranger was telling him that it had all been a lie. Not a lie exactly, but a tragedy. A series of events that had torn a family apart and left a young boy lost in a system that did not know how to find him. Antonio began to explain, his voice heavy with old pain. 28 years ago, he had a son named Michael. Michael had been the light of Antonio's life, a bright and idealistic young man who wanted nothing to do with the family business. Michael had fallen in love with a woman named Elena, a nurse at a hospital in Brooklyn. They had married in secret, knowing that Antonio would not approve of his son leaving the family to pursue an ordinary life. When Elena became pregnant, Michael decided to leave everything behind. He wanted to raise his child away from the shadow of the Castellano name, away from the danger and moral compromise that came with their world. He and Elena planned to start fresh in California, where nobody would know their history. But word of Michael's departure reached the wrong ears. A rival family saw an opportunity to strike at Antonio through his son. They intercepted Michael and Elena on their way out of the city. The details of what happened next were unclear even now, but the result was devastating. Michael and Elena's car was found at the bottom of a ravine in Pennsylvania. The bodies inside were burned beyond recognition, but the authorities assumed they belonged to the car's registered owners. Antonio had mourned his son for 28 years. He had carried that grief like a stone in his chest, never fully recovering from the loss. But 3 months ago, one of his people had discovered something that changed everything. Hospital records from a small town in Pennsylvania showed that a young woman matching Elena's description had been admitted on the night of the supposed accident. She had given birth to a baby boy before passing from her injuries. The baby had been placed in state custody and the trail had gone cold. Antonio had immediately launched a full investigation. His people had traced the baby through decades of bureaucratic records, through foster homes and group facilities, through name changes and relocated files. And finally, just yesterday, they had found him, Marcus Rivera, living in Newark, working as a delivery driver, completely unaware of his true heritage. "It was not coincidence that brought you to that warehouse tonight," Antonio said, his voice thick with emotion. "I arranged it. I needed to see you with my own eyes before I could believe it was true. I needed to know that my grandson was alive." Marcus finally found his voice. He had so many questions that they tripped over each other trying to get out. How could he be sure? How did he know Marcus was really his grandson, and not just someone who happened to be in the right place at the right time? What proof did he have? Antonio reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small photograph. He handed it to Marcus, and even in the dim light of the SUV, Marcus could see what it showed. It was a picture of a young man, probably in his mid-20s. He had dark, curly hair, a strong jaw, and eyes that were so familiar it made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. He was looking at a mirror image of himself, separated only by decades and a few minor differences. "That is your father," Antonio said. "Michael, when he was about your age. The resemblance is undeniable." But if you need more proof, I have already arranged for a genetic test. The results should be ready within 48 hours. Marcus stared at the photograph, his hands trembling slightly. All his life he had wondered about his parents. He had created stories in his mind, imagining who they might have been, why they might have left him. Some of those stories were kind, depicting parents who had to give him up for his own protection. Others were harsh, born from the bitterness of lonely nights in crowded foster homes. Never in any of those stories had he imagined this. A grandfather who was apparently one of the most powerful crime bosses on the East Coast. Parents who had been killed trying to escape that world. A legacy of wealth and power and danger that he had never known existed. The SUV crossed into Manhattan, the bright lights of the city creating a stark contrast to the dark industrial streets they had left behind. They drove through areas that Marcus had only seen in movies, past luxury high-rises and exclusive restaurants that catered to the wealthy and powerful. Finally, the SUV pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a towering building in the Upper East Side. The elevator ride to the penthouse was smooth and silent, the numbers climbing higher and higher until they reached the top floor. The doors opened onto a space that took Marcus's breath away. The penthouse was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. The furnishings were elegant but understated, speaking of old money rather than new wealth. Original artwork hung on the walls, and Marcus recognized at least one piece that he had seen in an art history textbook during his brief attempt at community college. Antonio led him through the main living area to a study lined with bookshelves. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, despite the warmth of the summer night outside. The old man settled into a leather armchair and gestured for Marcus to take the one across from him. For the next several hours, Antonio told Marcus everything. He spoke of the Castellano family's history, how they had risen to power in the early 20th century, how they had weathered wars and government crackdowns and rival family attacks. He spoke of his own life, his marriage to a woman named Sophia who had passed away 10 years ago, his struggle to balance power and morality in a world that often demanded one be sacrificed for the other. Most importantly, he spoke of Michael. He shared stories from Michael's childhood, his first steps and his first words, his love of books and his hatred of violence. He described the pain of watching his son pull away, the greater pain of believing he had lost him forever, and the desperate hope that had kept a small flame burning in his heart for nearly 3 decades. As the night wore on and dawn began to paint the sky outside the penthouse windows, Marcus felt something shifting inside himself. The anger he had carried for so long, the resentment toward parents who had seemingly abandoned him, began to transform into something else. It was not quite forgiveness, because there was nothing to forgive. His parents had loved him. They had died trying to give him a better life. The tragedy was not abandonment, but loss. Antonio noticed the change in Marcus's expression. The old man leaned forward, his eyes bright with tears he was no longer trying to hide. "I know this is overwhelming," Antonio said. "I know it will take time to process everything, but I want you to know that you have a home here. You have a family. You will never be alone again." Marcus looked at this man who was apparently his grandfather, this powerful figure who had moved heaven and earth to find him. He thought about the life he had lived, the struggles he had faced, the loneliness that had been his constant companion, and he thought about what it might mean to finally belong somewhere, to finally have people who cared whether he lived or died. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice rough with emotion. Antonio smiled, and for the first time, Marcus could see the resemblance between them. It was in the shape of the smile, the way it transformed the entire face, softening hardness into warmth. "Now," Antonio said, "you learn who you really are. And then, when you are ready, you take your rightful place in this family." Chapter 3. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. He moved out of his cramped studio apartment and into a guest suite in Antonio's penthouse that was larger than any home he had ever lived in. He was given a new wardrobe, a new car, and access to resources that seemed almost unlimited. But more than the material changes, it was the sense of belonging that transformed him most profoundly. He spent hours every day with Antonio, learning about the family business and its legitimate enterprises. The Castellanos had diversified significantly over the decades, investing in real estate, restaurants, import businesses, and various other ventures. While the origins of their wealth were undeniably connected to organized crime, Antonio had spent the past 20 years working to transition into fully legal operations. "It is the legacy I want to leave," Antonio explained during one of their many conversations. Not the violence and fear of the old days, but something my grandson can be proud of. Something that will endure long after I am gone. Marcus also learned about the people who worked for and with the family. There was Sophia, Antonio's chief of staff, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s who managed the day-to-day operations with ruthless efficiency. There was Marco, the head of security, a former military operative whose loyalty to Antonio was absolute. And there were dozens of others, each with their own role to play in the complex organization that Antonio had built. The genetic test results came back positive, confirming what Antonio had already known in his heart. Marcus was indeed his grandson, the only living heir to the Castellano legacy. The news spread quickly through both the legitimate business world and the more shadowy circles where the Castellano name still carried significant weight. Not everyone was pleased by this development. Marcus soon learned that his existence created complications for various people who had positioned themselves to benefit from Antonio's eventual passing. Without an heir, the Castellano empire would have been divided among various associates and business partners. Now those arrangements were thrown into question. Vincent Caruso was one of those people. The man who had mocked Marcus at the warehouse was, it turned out, a mid-level operator who had been positioning himself for greater power within the organization. He had cultivated relationships with key figures, made promises and deals, all based on the assumption that there would be a power vacuum when Antonio was no longer around. The humiliation of that night at the warehouse had clearly wounded his pride, but his reaction went beyond embarrassment. Marcus began to notice Vincent at various family gatherings and business meetings, always watching him with barely concealed hostility. The scar on Vincent's face seemed to twist whenever their eyes met, giving his expression a particularly menacing quality. Marcus mentioned his concerns to Antonio, but the old man waved them off. Vincent is ambitious but not foolish, Antonio said. He knows the consequences of moving against family. He will fall in line once he accepts the new reality. But Marcus was not so sure. He had survived too many dangerous situations to ignore his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that Vincent Caruso was a threat that should not be underestimated. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus began to find his footing in this new world. He discovered that he had a natural aptitude for business, an ability to see patterns and opportunities that others missed. Antonio was delighted by this, praising his grandson's quick mind and eager work ethic. But it was not just business skills that Marcus brought to the family. His years of struggling had given him a perspective that many in Antonio's circle lacked. He understood what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated. He knew how to read people, how to distinguish genuine loyalty from self-serving flattery. These skills, honed in foster homes and on the streets, proved invaluable in navigating the complex politics of the Castellano organization. One evening, about 3 months after Marcus's arrival, Antonio hosted a dinner party at the penthouse. It was a gathering of the family's closest associates, an annual tradition that served as both celebration and strategy session. Marcus was introduced as Antonio's grandson and heir, a formal acknowledgement that cemented his position within the organization. The guests were a mix of legitimate business people and figures whose backgrounds were more ambiguous. Marcus moved through the crowd with the grace and confidence that had developed over the past months, shaking hands and making small talk with people whose net worth probably exceeded the GDP of small nations. It was at this party that he met Elena Marchetti. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of wine in her hand, looking out at the city lights with an expression of quiet contemplation. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to outshine the more elaborate outfits around her, and her dark hair was pulled back to reveal a face that was striking in its intelligence rather than conventional beauty. Marcus found himself drawn to her without fully understanding why. He approached and introduced himself, and when she turned to face him, he felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were dark and deep, holding both warmth and caution in equal measure. Elena, it turned out, was a prosecutor with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Her presence at a Castellano family gathering was explained by her father, Roberto Marchetti, a legitimate real estate developer who had done business with Antonio for decades. Roberto insisted that all his dealings with the Castellanos were above board, and Elena had reluctantly agreed to accompany him to the dinner as a gesture of family solidarity. "I know who your grandfather is," Elena said bluntly when they had moved to a quieter corner of the room. "I know what this family represents, so why are you telling me you just found out about all of this a few months ago?" "Because it is the truth," Marcus replied. 3 months ago, I was delivering packages for a living. I had no idea any of this existed. Elena studied him with the analytical gaze of someone trained to detect deception. Whatever she saw must have convinced her, because her expression softened slightly. "That must have been quite a shock," she said. Marcus laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even himself. "Shock is an understatement. Some days I still wake up thinking this is all an elaborate dream." They talked for over an hour, moving from the window to a balcony overlooking the city. Elena was sharp-witted and direct, qualities that Marcus found refreshing after weeks of dealing with people who measured every word for political advantage. She challenged him, questioned his newfound position, and seemed genuinely curious about his perspective on the family he had inherited. For his part, Marcus found himself opening up in ways he rarely did. He told her about his childhood, about the loneliness and struggle that had defined his early years. He spoke of his confusion and wonder at discovering a family he had never known, and his determination to use his new position for something meaningful. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus and Elena exchanged phone numbers with a mutual understanding that this was not the last time they would see each other. There was something between them, something worth exploring despite the complications that both of their positions created. If you are watching this right now, I want you to take a moment and do something. Go down to the comments and write this sentence. "Sometimes the family we are born into finds us when we least expect it." This line represents the heart of this story, and I want to know if it resonates with you the way it resonates with me. The days following the party were busy for Marcus. Antonio had decided to accelerate his education in the family business, involving him in increasingly important decisions and negotiations. It was clear that the old man's health was beginning to decline, though he tried to hide it. Marcus noticed the way Antonio would pause mid-sentence to catch his breath, the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching. The thought of losing the grandfather he had just found filled Marcus with a desperate kind of determination. He threw himself into learning everything he could, absorbing information and building relationships with key figures in the organization. He wanted to be ready when the time came, not for power itself, but to protect what Antonio had built. Meanwhile, his relationship with Elena continued to develop. They met for coffee, for walks in Central Park, for quiet dinners in restaurants far from the circles where either of them might be recognized. Their conversations ranged from profound to playful, building a connection that felt both unexpected and inevitable. Elena was honest about her concerns. Her career was built on prosecuting criminals, and while she believed Marcus when he said he wanted to keep the family's operations legitimate, she knew how difficult that would be. The weight of history and expectation pressed down on families like the Castellanos, making change slow and dangerous. But she also saw something in Marcus that gave her hope. He was not raised in this world. He did not carry the same assumptions and loyalties that trapped so many others. He had a chance to be different, to chart a new course, and she wanted to believe that he would take it. For Marcus, Elena represented something equally important. She was a connection to the normal world, a reminder that there was life beyond power and money and family legacy. When he was with her, he could be just Marcus, not Antonio's heir, or the long-lost Castellano grandson. Just a man falling in love with a woman who challenged him to be better. But shadows were gathering on the horizon. Vincent Caruso had not forgotten his humiliation, and his ambition had only grown more dangerous in the months since Marcus's arrival. He had been quietly building alliances, making promises, and waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment, Vincent decided, was approaching fast. Chapter 4. Winter arrived in Manhattan with a fierce determination, blanketing the city in snow and ice that transformed the familiar streets into something almost magical. Marcus stood at the window of his suite in the penthouse, watching the white flakes drift past the glass as the city lights created a warm glow against the cold darkness. It had been 6 months since he discovered his true identity, and in that time his life had changed so completely that his previous existence seemed like a distant memory. He was no longer Marcus Rivera, the delivery driver scraping by in Newark. He was Marcus Castellano, heir to one of the most powerful families in the city. But power, he was learning, came with a weight that was not always easy to bear. Antonio's health had declined significantly over the past few weeks. The old man spent more and more time resting, his body finally surrendering to the years of stress and struggle that had defined his life. The doctors said it was his heart, weakened by decades of carrying burdens that most people could not imagine. Marcus had taken over most of the day-to-day operations, guided by Sophia and the other trusted members of Antonio's inner circle. He had surprised everyone, including himself, with his ability to handle the complex responsibilities. His background, which some had initially viewed as a liability, had become one of his greatest strengths. He understood struggle, he understood what it meant to fight for survival, and he brought a perspective to the family business that was desperately needed. The legitimate enterprises were thriving under his leadership. He had expanded into new markets, forged partnerships with companies that would never have considered working with the Castellanos a generation ago, and begun the process of completely severing ties with any remaining illegal operations. Not everyone was happy about these changes. There were those within the organization who profited from the old ways, who saw Marcus's reforms as a threat to their livelihoods and positions. Vincent Caruso was chief among them, though he had been careful to hide his opposition behind a mask of cooperation. But Marcus was not fooled. He had been watching Vincent carefully, noting the meetings that happened just out of sight, the phone calls that ended abruptly when Marcus entered a room, the subtle signs of conspiracy that years of survival had taught him to recognize. The confrontation came on a cold Thursday evening in January. Marcus had just finished a meeting with the heads of the family's restaurant division when Sophia pulled him aside. Her face was pale, her normally composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine fear. "We have a problem," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Vincent is making his move. Tonight," she explained quickly. Vincent had been building support among the more traditional elements of the organization, promising to return to the old ways and restore the family's criminal enterprises to their former prominence. He had recruited enough people to challenge Marcus's leadership, and he planned to present his case to the remaining family council that evening. But it was worse than a simple power play. Sophia had learned that Vincent was also in contact with the Martino family, longtime rivals of the Castellanos, who had been waiting for an opportunity to weaken their enemies. If Vincent succeeded in taking control, he would essentially be delivering the family into the hands of their greatest competitors. "Where is my grandfather?" Marcus asked, his mind racing through possibilities. "In his bedroom," Sophia replied. "He is too weak to move." Vincent timed this deliberately, waiting until Don Antonio could not oppose him directly. Marcus felt a cold fury building in his chest. This was not just about power or money. This was about his grandfather, the man who had searched for him for 28 years, who had given him a family and a purpose. Vincent was trying to steal everything Antonio had built, while the old man lay helpless in his bed. "Gather everyone who is still loyal to us," Marcus said, his voice hard. "We meet in 1 hour." The hour that followed was a whirlwind of activity. Marcus moved through the penthouse with a focus and determination that surprised even those who had come to respect him over the past months. He made phone calls, sent messages, and coordinated a response to Vincent's challenge with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this. When the family council gathered in the main conference room, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vincent stood at one end of the long table, surrounded by his supporters. Marcus stood at the other end, flanked by Sophia, Marco, and the others who had remained loyal. The debate that followed was fierce and at times personal. Vincent made his case for returning to the old ways, arguing that Marcus's reforms had weakened the family and made them vulnerable to their enemies. He painted himself as the protector of tradition, the guardian of everything the Castellanos had built over generations. Marcus listened patiently, letting Vincent speak his piece without interruption. And then, when the time came, he responded with a precision that left his opponent visibly shaken. "You speak of tradition," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "But you have forgotten what tradition truly means. My grandfather built this family on more than crime. He built it on loyalty, on honor, on protecting those who depend on us. You speak of returning to the old ways, but what you really want is to sell us out to the Martinos." A gasp went through the room. Vincent's face twisted with barely suppressed rage, but before he could respond, Marcus continued. "I have proof," Marcus said, pulling out a folder that Sophia had prepared. "Phone records, meeting notes, financial transfers. You have been in contact with the Martinos for months, making deals that would benefit you while destroying everything my grandfather has worked for." He laid the evidence on the table, letting the council members see for themselves. The silence that followed was deafening. One by one, Vincent's supporters began to distance themselves from him, recognizing that they had backed the wrong horse. Vincent made one last, desperate attempt. He lunged across the table toward Marcus, his face contorted with rage. But Marco was faster, intercepting him before he could reach his target. The security chief subdued Vincent with professional efficiency, pinning him to the ground while others moved to restrain his most loyal followers. The crisis was over in minutes, but its aftermath would reshape the family for years to come. Vincent and his closest associates were expelled from the organization, their assets seized and their positions eliminated. The Martinos, their scheme exposed, were forced to retreat and accept a new status quo that left them significantly weakened. But the true significance of the night became clear when Marcus went to his grandfather's room after the council meeting. Antonio was awake, propped up against pillows, his eyes bright despite his physical weakness. "I heard everything," the old man said, gesturing to an intercom that had been left open. "You handled it exactly as I would have. No, better than I would have. You showed strength without cruelty, wisdom without hesitation. You are ready." Marcus sat beside his grandfather's bed, taking the old man's weathered hand in his own. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened and what it meant for the future hung between them like a shared understanding. "I am proud of you," Antonio said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. "Your father would be proud of you too. You are everything I hoped you would be." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, but he did not try to hide them. After a lifetime of believing he had no one, of carrying his burdens alone, he had finally found his place. He had found his family, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. Chapter 5. Spring arrived in Manhattan with the kind of dramatic transformation that seemed to mirror the changes in Marcus's life. The trees in Central Park burst into bloom, the air warmed with promise, and the city seemed to shake off the grey weight of winter like a coat that was no longer needed. Antonio's health had stabilized somewhat, though everyone knew that his time was limited. The old man had accepted this reality with the same grace that had defined his entire life, focusing his remaining energy on preparing Marcus for the responsibilities that would soon be his alone. The family's transformation continued under Marcus's leadership. The last vestiges of illegal operations were being systematically eliminated, replaced by legitimate businesses that would ensure the Castellano legacy for generations to come. It was not always easy. There were those who resisted change, who clung to the old ways out of habit or self-interest, but Marcus handled each challenge with a combination of firmness and understanding that earned him respect from even the most skeptical members of the organization. His relationship with Elena had deepened considerably over the winter months. They had moved past the initial caution of their early interactions into something that felt like genuine partnership. Elena had introduced Marcus to her father, Roberto, who had been surprisingly supportive of the relationship despite its complications, and Marcus had brought Elena into his world, showing her the changes he was making and the future he was building. One evening in late April, Marcus took Elena to a rooftop garden he had discovered in the meatpacking district. The space was magical in the fading light, filled with flowers and small trees that seemed to have been transported from some Italian countryside. They sat together on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I have something to ask you," Marcus said, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with business or family politics. Elena turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the warm light of the sunset. Whatever she saw in his expression made her breath catch slightly. Marcus reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. He opened it to reveal a ring, a simple but elegant diamond set in platinum. The stone had belonged to his grandmother Sophia, one of the few possessions Antonio had given him, with explicit instructions to save for this moment. "Elena Marchetti," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "6 months ago, I did not even know who I was. I had no family, no future, no hope for anything beyond survival. And then I found you, and everything changed. Not because of the wealth or the power or the name. Because of you. Because you saw me for who I really am, and you loved me anyway. Will you marry me?" Elena's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring, then at Marcus, then back at the ring again. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she did not speak, and then a smile broke across her face like the sunrise they had watched together on so many mornings. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, and then they were in each other's arms, holding tight, as if the world might try to tear them apart. The sun sank below the horizon, leaving them in the soft glow of city lights and the warmth of a future that neither had dared to imagine. The engagement was announced at a family gathering the following week, with Antonio presiding from his wheelchair with an expression of pure joy. The old man had given his blessing enthusiastically, declaring that Elena was exactly the kind of woman the family needed. Strong, principled, and brave enough to challenge the status quo. The months that followed were filled with wedding preparations and continued work on the family's transformation. Eleanor, true to her nature, insisted that the wedding be relatively modest, a private ceremony followed by a reception for close friends and family. Marcus readily agreed, having no desire for the kind of lavish display that would draw attention and scrutiny. They chose a small church in Brooklyn for the ceremony, not far from where Marcus's parents had been married in secret nearly 3 decades earlier. It seemed fitting, a way to honor the love story that had preceded their own while starting their new chapter. The wedding day arrived on a perfect September afternoon. The church was filled with flowers, and the pews were occupied by the small group of people who had become important to Marcus over the past year. Antonio sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving his grandson, as Marcus stood at the altar, waiting for his bride. When Elena appeared at the back of the church, escorted by her father, Marcus felt his breath leave his body. She was wearing a simple white gown that seemed to float around her as she walked, and her face was radiant with a joy that matched his own. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They exchanged vows that they had written themselves, words that spoke of struggle and hope, of finding light in darkness, of building a future together that neither had thought possible. When the priest pronounced them married and they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in applause. The reception was held at a restaurant in Manhattan that the family had recently acquired as part of their legitimate business expansion. The space had been transformed for the occasion, filled with candles and flowers, and the warmth of people who genuinely cared about the couple's happiness. Antonio gave a toast that brought tears to nearly every eye in the room. He spoke of loss and recovery, of despair and hope, of a family that had been broken and was now being healed. He raised his glass to Marcus and Elena, blessing their union and their future with words that carried the weight of a lifetime's wisdom. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus found a quiet moment with his grandfather. The old man looked tired but content, his face carrying a peace that Marcus had not seen before. "You have given me everything," Antonio said, taking Marcus's hand. "A grandson, a great-grandson or great-granddaughter to come, a legacy that will endure. I can face what comes next, knowing that everything I built will be in good hands." Marcus squeezed his grandfather's hand, understanding what the old man was saying and accepting it with the same grace that Antonio had shown throughout his illness. "Thank you," Marcus said, "for finding me, for believing in me, for giving me a family." They sat together in comfortable silence, grandfather and grandson, as the last guests departed and the candles burned low. Outside, the city hummed with its eternal energy, indifferent to the small dramas of human life playing out in its midst. But for Marcus, the city had never felt more alive, more full of possibility. He had started his journey as a nobody, an orphan with nothing, and now he stood at the center of a world that had welcomed him, challenged him, and ultimately transformed him into the man he was always meant to be. Chapter 6. 5 years later, the Castellano organization was unrecognizable from what it had been when Marcus first stumbled into that warehouse on a rainy Newark night. Under his leadership, the family had completed its transformation into a fully legitimate business empire with holdings in real estate, hospitality, technology, and philanthropy. The penthouse where Marcus had first met his grandfather was now home to a different kind of activity. The sounds of children's laughter echoed through the halls as Marcus and Elena's twins, Antonio Jr. and Sophia, turned the elegant space into their personal playground. The children, now 4 years old, had brought a joy to the family that nobody had anticipated. Antonio Sr. had passed away peacefully 2 years after Marcus's wedding, surrounded by his family in the home he loved. His death, while mourned deeply, was also celebrated as the completion of a remarkable life. He had lived long enough to see his great-grandchildren born, to witness the transformation of his family's legacy, and to know that everything he had built would endure. Marcus had grieved his grandfather's passing with the depth of someone who understood how precious family truly was. He had spent a lifetime without one, and the years he had shared with Antonio were among the most meaningful of his life. But he had also found comfort in knowing that Antonio had died happy, at peace with his legacy, and confident in the future. Eleanor had proven to be the partner Marcus had always needed. She had left the district attorney's office to join the family's philanthropic foundation, using her legal expertise to create programs that helped at-risk youth escape the cycles of poverty and crime that had nearly claimed Marcus himself. Her work had earned national recognition and had become a model for similar initiatives across the country. The foundation was named after Michael and Elena Rivera, Marcus's parents. It seemed fitting that their memory would live on through work that helped others avoid the tragedy that had befallen their small family. Every child who received a scholarship, every family who found stable housing through the Foundation's programs was a testament to the love story that had ended too soon, but whose impact continued to ripple outward. On a warm Saturday morning in June, Marcus sat in the garden of their new home in Westchester, watching the twins play on the swing set that he had helped build. Elena sat beside him, her hand resting on her stomach where their third child was growing, another girl who would arrive before the end of summer. "It is hard to believe," Marcus said, his voice soft with wonder, "where we started, where we are now." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, her eyes on their children as they shrieked with laughter, pumping their legs to swing higher and higher. "I think about it sometimes," she replied. "That night at your grandfather's party, when we first met, I almost did not go. My father had to practically drag me there." Marcus smiled at the memory. "And I almost did not approach you. You looked so serious, standing by yourself at that window. I thought you might tell me to get lost." "I might have," Elena admitted with a laugh, "if you had not been so genuine. If you had tried to impress me with money or power, or any of the things that other men in that world use. But you just talked to me like a normal person, like someone who actually wanted to know who I was." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the peace of the moment requiring no words. The garden was alive with the sounds of summer, birds and insects, and the distant hum of traffic from the road below. It was a simple scene, the kind of ordinary happiness that Marcus had once believed was forever beyond his reach. His phone buzzed with a message from Sophia, who still ran the day-to-day operations of the family business from the Manhattan office. A routine update, nothing urgent. The machine that Marcus had helped build continued to run smoothly, generating wealth and opportunity that benefited not just the family, but the thousands of people who worked for their various enterprises. The twins abandoned their swings and came running toward their parents, their faces flushed with exertion and joy. Antonio Jr. climbed onto Marcus's lap, while Sophia claimed her mother's attention, both children bubbling over with stories about their adventures in the garden. Marcus looked at his wife, his children, the home they had built together. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the rain-soaked night in Newark that had changed everything, the grandfather who had searched for him across decades, the love that had found him when he least expected it, and he realized that the most important lesson of his life had nothing to do with power or money or family legacy. It was simpler than that, and more profound. Family is not about blood or names or inherited wealth. It is about choosing to love someone and being chosen in return. It is about showing up day after day through struggle and triumph, through joy and grief. It is about building something together that is greater than any individual could achieve alone. Marcus Rivera Castellano had spent 28 years believing he was alone in the world. And then, on a rainy night in Newark, a phone had rung, and everything had changed. If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying I have watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own family or the family you hope to build someday, I want you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel if you have not already. We have many more stories like this one, stories about love and hope and the power of human connection to transform even the darkest circumstances. Second, leave a like on this video. It helps more people discover these stories and join our community of viewers who appreciate meaningful content. Third, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. We all know someone who is struggling, someone who feels alone, someone who has forgotten that miracles are possible. Maybe this story will remind them that life can surprise us, that families can find each other across any distance, that love is always stronger than fear. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time. The twins were asleep in their beds, tired from a full day of summer adventures. Elena had retired early, her pregnancy making rest more necessary than usual. The house was quiet, peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of a family at rest. Marcus stood at the window of his study, looking out at the night sky. Stars were visible here in a way they never had been in the city, scattered across the darkness like promises waiting to be kept. On his desk sat a framed photograph that Antonio had given him years ago. It showed his parents, Michael and Eleanor, on their wedding day. They were young and in love and completely unaware of the tragedy that awaited them, but their smiles were genuine, their happiness real, their hope for the future evident in every line of their faces. Marcus had learned to look at that photograph without sadness. The grief was still there, would always be there, for parents he had never known and a life that had been stolen from them. But alongside the grief was gratitude. Gratitude for his grandfather's determination to find him, gratitude for Elena's love and the children they had created together, gratitude for the chance to honor his parents' memory by living the kind of life they would have wanted for him. He picked up the photograph and held it for a moment, studying the faces of the young couple who had brought him into the world. Then he set it back down and turned off the light in his study. The day was over. The story was not finished, would never really be finished, because life continued forward in all its messy, beautiful, unpredictable glory. But for tonight, for this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Marcus Castellano, the delivery driver who had become the Don's heir, walked through his quiet house and climbed the stairs to join his wife in their bed. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, and somewhere in the city, another story was just beginning, the end.